Cool. Thanks everyone for coming together this morning. I just wanted to have a sync up discussion on where to show vulnerabilities that are not tied to projects, especially before Andy goes out on parental leave. I know we had discussed this earlier in, maybe it was like at the end of last year when Kyle was still with us, and we sort of came to a soft decision of using tabs, but I don't know that that'll address all use cases, and I just wanted to kick that off again because we're actually getting pretty close to actually working in this area. So we're, you know, wanting to make sure that if we do end up contributing towards this, because I know it's pretty far out, Matt, on your priorities, we want to make sure that it still is consistent with your direction and with where you want things to go in the threat insight space. Just to get things kicked off and to describe the problem that we have, we're going to need to be able to scan images in GitLab's registry at some point. We also need the ability to scan containers that are running in production. And each of those have their own challenges with them. Scanning images in GitLab's registry, the nice thing about that is at least there is a GitLab object that they're tied to, which would be the container image in the registry. They may or may not also be associated with a project. They may or may not also be associated with an environment, one or more environments or clusters. But at least there's always one object to anchor off of for that. Talking about scanning containers in production, that could be any production Kubernetes cluster. So there's no guarantee that that maps back to any object at all that we have inside of GitLab. They may have set up a cluster in GitLab, either at the project group or I don't know if it's the instance, I think it's the workspace level essentially, but it could map back to one of those clusters. It could map back to an environment if they have that created in GitLab. It could map back, because it maps back through an environment, you could basically assume the project that it's associated with. But again, none of that is a guarantee. It could just be a cluster that has nothing else to do with GitLab that's out there. And so that's sort of the problem. It's not an easy problem to solve. But the question is, once we allow customers to start scanning these things, where do we surface those vulnerabilities? And, how do we present that triage workflow? I don't have answers, just, wanted to kick off the discussion. And the goal of this meeting would be to at least come to some sort of like notional consensus about where we want to solve this so that, when Andy goes out on parental leave, Annabelle can continue working and at least have it somewhat aligned with the threat insights, goals and directions.
So Sam, I want to ask about that last scenario. I'm having kind of trouble visualizing this. Where would the container scan be initiated in a non-GitLab controlled cluster? Is that coming from GitLab, or is that actually inside of the running container something is scanning?
Yeah, so that is a good point, and that may be a way to tie it back to the project. It would be associated with, it would be created using our policy editor. And our policy editor will eventually be available at the project group and workspace level. But they would be creating, say, a project level policy that says, on a weekly basis, on Sunday at midnight, I want to kick off a scan against all the pods, all the containers in this cluster, and they would kind of fill that in. It's the same thing with DAST too, right? Like you can actually use DAST today if you configure it right to scan a production website, but it's initiated from the context of a project. So we could associate it back to that project where it was configured from, or the group or the workspace in the future.
Yeah, I don't know from a visibility perspective if that's necessarily the best, but I do like that as maybe at least a starting point to explore, since there has to be an anchor, right? Like it has to start from somewhere. For a thing like DAST, where really, to your point, you're just pointing a tool at anywhere. If you choose to abuse it, you could point it at a website you do not own. It seems like that's very much more disconnected from the normal vulnerability workflow. So I don't know if there needs to be some sort of like a different catch-all space, like at the workspace level. I think what I'd be most concerned about is visibility to the user to know if they've initiated all these sort of like non-object connected scans for things. How do I know, number one, that there's something that needs my attention? Number two, how do I know where it is?
And building off of that with regards to DAST, so not only can you point that scanner to whatever URL that you might not necessarily own, but for on-demand scans, we also are starting to associate them with a branch that you can choose. And there's nothing actually tying the two together. So if you point it at like staging and you say this is the code that's on the staging branch, there's no way to prove that actually. So if you don't set it up right, then you could potentially have environments that are showing vulnerabilities on a branch that doesn't actually correspond to it. Yeah, it's a bummer.
I don't like that one because people are going to come and blame me, and I won't say Andy, Chiago for that one. Why aren't these results really in the branch? That's a great point, though, is we want to make sure that there's a very clear line between whatever is found and the source of that problem.
This would be helpful to say our goal with the vulnerability management space is to treat these reports as the single source of truth. So if as possible as we can do, all the vulnerabilities should be displayed in a singular location that they can be tracked, triaged, and resolved from. So if we could avoid unique instances or locations where just a subset of vulnerabilities display so that we can have our users going to one of 2 or 3 locations in the product, that would be the ideal case.
Yeah, it seems like we're already in that mess a bit today because we have everything at the project level. So each project shows its own subset. I mean, what you're describing sounds like rolling everything up to a workspace level, single dashboard view where you have one place to go to see everything.
And we're probably going to be getting there with the security center, right? Because that's everything that will display everything that at the user level they have purview over in their GitLab instance or workspace. So that could be an alternative down the road. But even like groups and projects, I kind of treat them the same as the single source of truth, just depending on however level you take it. Should be where vulnerabilities are tracked and triaged from.
So, I mean, I guess there's a question to explore, right? Do we just roll everything up to the security center and not even attempt to associate it with a project or a group or something lower on?
Well, what if? Well, so it's additive, right? That's the unique thing about the security center. So you have to opt in your projects you want to see. Could you opt in clusters or environments too?
Well, I'm saying, what if all clusters and all environments were just opted in and it rolled? I mean, so like projects aside, put that aside for a minute, right? Maybe this is a different page or a different tab or whatever, right? But rather than opting things in, what if all of those just rolled up there and you couldn't see it at the project level, you couldn't see it at the group level, but there was one dashboard at the workspace level and the security center that just showed everything. In this case, everything that's not correlated with the project. So everything in production or everything from your registry. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there to explore it as an option.
I don't think that's like a bad path at all. I think it's potentially solves a lot of cases. The only thing that we would want to consider is that permission or view level. If the user, like what determines the user to have access to view vulnerabilities of a cluster versus a project. Like if I'm not associated with a project, I can't even add it to that dashboard. So
Yeah.
how do we draw that line?
Yeah, that's a good point. The permissioning on that is a bit tricky. I wonder, so all of these vulnerabilities, the one thing that they will all be associated with is either a scan or a policy. Like there's something that initiated the scan to kick it off, right? And we know which individuals have permission to view that scan and which individuals have permissions to edit that scan. So we might be able to kind of cue off of that and say, you know, if you are one of the individuals who set this thing up, then you have rights to view the vulnerability. If you know, if you're on the project and you could view the scan, then you have rights to view it. If you were on the project and had rights to actually edit that scan and configure it, then you probably have rights to dismiss the vulnerability as well and interact with the vulnerability in that way. So that might be one potential solution.
Yeah, I think
But
the
I
only
don't know how complicated that gets in the backend database model to trace all of that out. But technical implications aside, you know, just thinking about the user perspective, that might be one way to have it work well.
Yeah, I think the only thing that gets complicated is that the group, whatever happens at the group level, just because that vulnerability report is probably one of the only ones that is like project specific, like looking at projects within or filtering for without doing too much heavy lifting at the group level. But I even think of like, if you set the scan up in a project, I feel like there would be an expectation to see the results of that scan in that project as well, right? Or at least the location I did, with the bonus of being able to see the results of all of my image scans at a global level. It's kind of how sysdig works, or many of these similar type vendors, is they kind of operate at a level above all the projects and pipelines and everything that they have going on because they're bolted on. So, because sysdig supports like Jenkins scanning and CI/CD and then registries and stuff and other cool runtime things. So, kind of bounded by our architecture.
I guess one thing, Sam, and this is certainly that's what we're going to solve here. Even just on the scanning side, we have a lot of improvements that we can make in terms of, and we'll say, difficulty getting a common nomenclature for what we want to call a thing a scanner found in a particular location or a context, right? So if we're able to start identifying these vulnerabilities, what we've got the problem right now in just the, the code scanning side, if I find something in an MR, I don't really have a lot of smarts to say where that thing also exists. We're only doing these sort of dumb comparisons between, we found a fingerprint for a thing in branch A and it also is in branch B. It's probably the same thing, but it's not doing things like saying, well, it's also in all these other branches, or this is where it came from. Like there's no sort of that tracer bullet. And
Right.
I'm a little worried that if we start doing all these container scannings, we're going to find a lot of vulnerabilities, but it's going to be very difficult to tie that back to say, here is where the actual problem is. And right, because what if I have cloned a particular container image 10 times over and it was that original source one where I introduced a vulnerability, but I've only discovered it way out here,
Yep.
right? So we're going to have that same problem of duplicate findings, which are really the same vulnerability, which have the same root cause. I don't know if that's going to be better or worse than what we've got now from the vulnerability side. Just an additional challenge to think about.
Yeah, it is tricky. I mean, I think for a first MVC or going from an iterative perspective, if we do use tabs or a different page or some way separate out what's in production versus not, like, at least we're not having duplicate findings in the same list. So, you know, I think that's going to be an acceptable MVC, but you're right. Like the next thing we're going to want to do after that is say, okay, you know, this exists in production. Does this also exist in my source code, or do I just need to deploy my latest code and that would solve the problem, right? So that's kind of the next question is how do I fix it? And if we're not able to do that duplicate matching, then, you know, that's going to limit our ability there. I think there is still value even if we do have duplicates, but yeah, that is a good challenge to keep in mind that we're going to want to address as a follow-on.
I'm wondering if it changes at all to the way that we would potentially approach this if, and the things that we're looking for, I mean, when we talk about environments, I mean, environments are really what? Just a combination of container images plus deployed application code plus anything like a Helm chart, sort of the infrastructure as code piece associated with it. I wonder if we try to make sure that we're looking at things a little bit more discreetly. This is almost kind of getting into the asset management side of things, right? Like if we're actually, if we start to think about it as an asset-based approach, then you can start doing things like fingerprinting, let's say a Helm configuration, to make it easier to say, well, where else do I have that deployed, instead of duplicate scans finding the same kind of thing and not being able to link those together. Does that make sense?
Yes. And that, you know, thinking about it in that regard would probably help us most of the time. It is more of an edge case, but, you know, it's possible that an attacker gains control of a container and then they go install their own packages. And so that would not have come from a Helm chart, right? So the tricky thing is like, the only thing that we can really tie it back to is if we want to go with like an asset-based or an entity-based approach, the asset would be this container running in this production cluster. And so how do we, I don't know, that gets tricky too, because containers typically tend to be pretty ephemeral. And so they spin up, they go away. It's not like you want to track that exact asset over a long period of time.
I guess though, from a like a what went into the container perspective, though, it had to come from a particular Docker image or something, right? Like there is a source of it. And then, yeah, I mean, you're right. If somebody is installing packages nefariously inside of the container, maybe that is sort of getting into like a kind of a different use case because it's a vulnerability, but that's more like an active attack, which I think would come more from your venting and alert management system. I've detected a thing that goes into a different area, which a human looks at and determines like, what was the root cause? And ultimately, maybe there was a misconfiguration a scanner didn't pick up. They convert that manually to a vulnerability to remediate the misconfiguration or something.
Right. Yeah, there certainly are other ways of detecting that attack in production. I mean, what you're describing though, it really you know, the other piece of that maps back to an image, because it's always spawned from an image is what spawns a container. So we can map it back to an image. That image may or may not be in our GitLab registry, but we can at least map it back to an image, right? In an image version, an image tag.
So with that, if we did something like that at the workspace level, is that high enough? Does that have enough purview? Like, does the GitLab registry cover, or other way around, sorry, does the workspace level, would that cover anything in the GitLab registry and potentially anything at a group or a project level?
Yeah, I mean, I think Workspace would cover it because we're talking about things that may not be associated with any group or project at all, other than the fact that that's where you wrote the policy to initiate the scan. Because again, like I could just have a cluster out there and the only thing tying it to GitLab is the fact that I have a policy that says go scan that cluster. right? And so in that case, those images are not in the GitLab registry. The code isn't even in GitLab. Like I'm just scanning this cluster and getting some some vulnerability results. And so it seems to me like something at that level, the workspace level, would make the most sense. But I can also see the argument of like, if I've configured a policy at the project level, that I may want to see those vulnerabilities there at the project level as well. So I'm not sure, maybe we do both, and just roll those up to the workspace level, but also show it. If it was a project level policy, then maybe we show it at the project level as well.
I think where we show it depends on where the user wants to fix it. So when you're thinking of triaging vulnerability, you create an issue from it. That vulnerability typically associated with a project, so the issue you create goes right into the project that you're going to do the work against that vulnerability. So these vulnerabilities seem to not be tied to a particular project with any confidence, I'm assuming. So is there a way to have some type of determination on where users want to address or how they would in their GitLab workflow?
The only way to know that would be for them to tell us. Like, we're not going to be able to infer it off of anything other than, like I said, where did they create the policy? So sort of, like I said, we could make the assumption that, okay, if they're in the GitLab project and they make a policy there, then the assumption is that they're going to be fixing it in the GitLab project. But, we wouldn't be able to know that. There's no way of knowing that for certain. We'd have to rely on either that assumption of where they created the policy, or they would have to tell us in some way.
Is this the same case as container scanning as well? Like, is that the same assumption, or is that more deterministic that we know that fix will go on in that project?
For container scanning, like when we're scanning as part of the pipeline job, it's going to be pretty, like they technically could scan an external container, but that's an uncommon way for people to use it that way. It's usually fixed in the project, but it's the same problem as DAST. Like you can point the container scanning engine at any container in any registry anywhere, and it could have nothing to do whatsoever with your project if you wanted it to be that way. So we have that problem already today in a lot of ways.
Well, maybe we flip this around though. I guess I'd almost kind of ask the question, why would I do something in a project that had absolutely nothing to do with it unless I just didn't have another way to do what I was trying to accomplish, like with GitLab? Because I feel like we just kind of need to maybe almost explore that assumption of, if something happens, like the work is getting started in the project level, I think it kind of is a reasonable conclusion to say, well, the results would come back there, and whatever the context of what you were scanning, whether it has anything to do with the project or not, like that's up to you, user who did the thing. Because Andy, you made a great point. Like, I didn't really think about that, but if I'm doing stuff at the workspace level, that's all about visibility and being able to drill in quickly. But if I've got this whole management layer up at the top, how do I assign work down from that? Like, how do I make issues and MRs from the workspace level? I'm still going to have to go down and pick a project to do that in. And that's going to be a lot tougher if you've got, 5,000 projects and you're having to kind of figure that out every time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a prime candidate for problem validation, because there's so many things that could come out of this that could be really useful. Like maybe there's a whole new asset management and response page on the security center, or maybe there's settings that allow you to point at whatever is being scanned in the cluster and say, I want to associate results with a project, or I want to be able to create issues automatically from this project. So I think there's a lot to suss out. I think, Matt, that's another point you were making, is like, I just picked a place because like that's it's like the best project I could guess. So I think that, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm worried too that we're also being very GitLab centric about this right now because we're working in the confines of the tool we've got. I would venture, Sam, that there's a non-zero chance that a problem validation will uncover, hey, like that's awesome. We can do all this stuff with inside GitLab. I don't care about all these projects and issues things. Build me, security person, an area and let me do the following things that just don't exist in GitLab today.
Right. Yeah, I can definitely see that, right? Where the thing we know today is that users, you know, and it may just be reviewing some of the research we've already done, but we know that a large number of our customers are out buying external solutions to do production container scanning. And some of these solutions are very broad. They have a huge feature set. And oftentimes what I see is the customer is only using the production container scanning element of that entire huge security solution, right? So there definitely is a need for it. Obviously, if it's an external solution today, it's not being associated back to any sort of project or group or anything of that nature. It's just saying, you know, tell me what cluster to scan, and it goes and scans it and it comes back with the results. So you're right. Like we may be overthinking all of this a little bit. Like when we compare it to current solutions, they're just going out and scanning whatever cluster you tell them to scan and giving you the findings. Maybe that's a better place to start for an MVC.
It may be too. It kind of feels like over time, the bigger that GitLab as an application gets, the more likely we're going to start ending up with these highly specialized features that technically can integrate and use other parts of GitLab, but that people won't want to because it serves their need and that's all they need to use for it. Right?
Yep.
This could be one of them. It feels like if we're building a pretty hefty security Death Star.
Yeah, sure.
And the more functionality we build out, the more specialized I think it's going to become to just security teams. I think you might just be the tip of the spear with this, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we've got 2 minutes left. Technically, I guess we're 3 minutes over, but I just want to make sure that Annabelle and I are not blocked, you know, especially Andy with you going out here on parental leave soon. You know, I know, Matt, you had expressed concerns before about showing them in the same view. You know, you wanted to see them in a separate view of some sort, whether it was a tab or a different page. Are there any other things that we should talk about or constraints that we should be aware of before we, you know, go off to do the design and you know, problem and solution validation that needs to be done here?
Top of my head, no. I think just making it clear to the user what they're looking at and getting people to the right context is just kind of the main objective. I mean, we had something very similar with fuzz testing where they were sort of building out this whole parallel experience. And at the end of the day, it was like that either needs to be completely separate or, you know, a fuzzing vulnerability is just an unknown. Put it in the existing context. So I do like the tabbed approach. I think it's very consistent with the way that we're starting to see a lot of other parts of the UI that are like very like functions.
And architecturally, it makes sense too, because this is how some of the industry will think. You know, there's code, there's assets. So having tabs separated by that, I think, follows existing architecture.
All right, well, thanks for your time today. I know we're up on it. Yeah, thanks for the sync up. We're going to be diving into this in the near future as you know, this is starting to become a higher priority on our end.
Cool.
Awesome.
Thanks. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks. Yep.